Okay, so we've got two different lectures on organization because it's a really important step to your paper. Note that in the chapter 5 discussion in the Landrum book discusses literature reviews, but it tends to focus on a literature review that would be like an introduction for an empirical study. For this paper, you're just doing a literature review. That's the end point of the paper. So just kind of be aware of that. You'll use similar strategies though. Okay. So in your literature review, you'll be using the work of others to support your argument. Your sources should be academic. If you only use non-academic sources, people would probably be skeptical of your argument. But in using these sources, you need to be sure to treat them fairly and respectfully. Try to make sure that you've done a thorough assessment of the literature. So if there's a big name that everyone's citing, you need to make sure that you have included work by that person. So that's kind of making sure that it's complete. You need to be respectful. It's definitely possible that there are limitations in the study, and it's certainly okay to point that out. But every study has some merit, and so you need to make sure to kind of balance that. You also need to put citations in where they make sense. So generally, the citations go at the end of the sentence, but you don't have to automatically put it at the end of the sentence. Sometimes it's clear if you put it at the end of a thought. So often it's before a comma or other punctuation, rather than at the very end. Okay. So this is an example of why it's important to kind of think about where you put the citation. So we've got pollination of this plant has been studied in both the field and the lab, and we have 2 citations. I don't know from the way these studies are cited whether Arnold did their studies in the field and Howard did them in the laboratory, or Howard did them in the field and Arnold did them in the laboratory, or if both authors did both settings. And so this is kind of a not ideal way to use citations in this case because there's really 2 different points. So if you rewrite the sentence or do the citation slightly differently, now it says the pollination has been studied in both the field. Here we cite Arnold because they're the person who did it in the field, and the laboratory, and Howard's work addresses the laboratory issue. And it's much clearer who did what. A third example, if you actually meant to say that both studies or both authors did both types of study, then you could actually reword the sentence to make it clear that both Arnold and Howard have studied the pollination in the field and the lab. Okay, so one of the things that I find that students struggle with the most is synthesizing their sources, which means kind of figuring out what are the common themes in your sources, what are the differences, and how are you going to break that up into themes in your paper. You need to have themes. One of the most important things that I hope you get out of this class is that if you're writing a big literature review, it shouldn't be a summary of one article, and then a summary of another article, and then a summary of another article. I want you to draw the relevant pieces from each article to support your ideas. And so you may cite an article multiple times. You're going to be integrating ideas from multiple articles. You should have multiple articles that support the same point. And so this is really important to be able to figure out how to synthesize or draw them together. Okay, so a couple of steps, and your assignment for this week is a worksheet, the first half of a worksheet that helps to address this. So as you're synthesizing your sources, first of all, you need to kind of organize by deciding what information you're looking for. Okay, so get some idea. If you have a topic, you have a thesis statement, you might already start thinking about what are the subsections or common themes that you see. You also need to mark similar information from each source in a similar manner. So if you're looking at peer relationships and you want to look at friendship and victimization and acceptance, you may have some articles that address all 3. You might have some that just address 1. You might have some that address 2. And so you need to find a way to identify all of your friendship information, all of your victimization information, all of your acceptance information. Then you need to kind of figure out which information is shared among your sources. So you want to look at the summary of information from all of your sources. Okay, so this is central information. These are maybe definitions. that you find common among your sources. You'll also have some information that's only in some sources. So it might be central, but probably less relevant. And then you'll have some information that's not shared among your sources. So it's specific to one article and not necessarily to the research you're doing. And this is more peripheral. So generally a good start is to think about what information is shared among all of your sources and what information is more peripheral. And so then once you get that figured out, you might start with a list and then incorporate, so start listing the central information and then start incorporating the less shared information. So at this point, I want to share your worksheets. Okay, so this is your first half of the organizing ideas worksheet, and you should read through this really carefully, but I kind of want to summarize for you in this video, and then you can go through in more depth on your own. So your paper is a literature review, which synthesizes past research to help you engage in an argument, right? So you're kind of have a conversation basically with the literature, between the literature. So there are 5 steps that are generally carried out in this order, but the process isn't linear, which means you might get to a point where you realize you don't have enough literature and you actually need to step back and go review it. So the first thing is gather your sources. You should be done. You should have a good amount of relevant literature. You should also be done or almost done reading and summarizing your sources, annotating, taking notes, things like that. The next step that you're going to work on today is developing common themes. So themes are ideas that are based on your reading of the sources and your understanding of the topic. And this is going to help you organize your paper into sections. In a paper this long, you have to have subsections. So you need to kind of identify some way to break up your topic and your thesis. Probably the most common one is subtopics. Okay, so are there minor topics that influence your major one? If you're studying PTSD and memory, you might have short-term memory and others that focus on long-term memory, and you might break it up that way. Chronology, if you're looking at something maybe across the lifespan, you might break it up into information about childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Methodology, so potentially you might compare experimental versus correlational studies, strengths or weaknesses. Fields of study, so you might have, clinical perspectives on ADHD versus educational psychology perspectives. Demographics, so you might break up your topic into the effects based on socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity, age, things like that. Different conclusions or geography potentially. As you're reading the material, you should be starting to get some ideas of how you might organize it. And you want to pick a theme. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. It doesn't have to be the end all and be all, but you need to have some ideas of the themes or sections of your paper. Okay, so where we're at now is you're going to organize your ideas. So you should pick a couple of themes to organize the literature you've read. Now, what I'm asking you to turn in for this week is not everything, okay? So I've asked you to use 5 sources. Now your worksheet is blank. This is an example just to make sure that everyone kind of understands. Like I said, this is only 5 sources. You're welcome to add more. You will have more, and I think it would be useful to do it for all of your sources. So let's say I'm doing a paper that has to do with friendship and the transition to college. These are made up sources. This is made up information. But let's say as I've been reading, I notice a couple themes. I've got some studies that look at college transition and the well-being, so how well students are doing during the college transition. Another theme I've noticed is friendship stability, so how stable are friendships over time. And then a third theme is there's some articles that focus specifically on friendship in college. So I need to figure out which articles address which of my themes in order to kind of come to some conclusions about what I'm going to be able to say about each of these things. So your sources, each source is a row. So my columns are my different themes that I've picked. And again, your theme will differ based on your topic, but for each theme, you should have multiple articles that address that theme. And each article may not address every single theme. Okay, so as you can see, I've got some blank squares here, and that's okay. Okay, so my first made-up source focused only on the college transition and well-being and found the increased loneliness during the transition, more depression right after the transition, but it goes away. Okay, so what I've put in this box is kind of the summary, the main points with regard to college transition and well-being. My second source talks about friendship stability and friendship in college. So it talks about the average length of a high school friendship. There's also some information about which students maintain high school friendships and college friendships. Okay, so I've addressed 2 points with this study. My third study looks at, talks about the fact that higher quality friendships are associated with better well-being, and it also talks about the college transition and friendship. So I've got some information there. My fourth study focuses on the middle school transition, but maybe I can draw some conclusions about the college transition. So I've noted that it's about the middle school transition, but I also have effects on well-being. And it also talks about friendship stability. So I've made a note about that as well. And then my third study actually addresses all 3 of these. So I've got notes in all 3. So what I can see is if I go down the column of college transition and well-being, I can take a really quick look and see what kind of conclusions can I make. This study found more loneliness and depression. This study found that maybe friendship quality can protect that. This study found that in the middle school transition, it seems to be associated with lower self-esteem and more loneliness and more depression and loneliness. So when I look at all those different studies that have addressed my theme of college transition and well-being, I can make a conclusion like multiple studies have found that the college transition seems to lead to a decrease in emotional well-being. And then I can go into a little more detail. I have 2 or 3 studies who have found an increase in loneliness. I have a couple that have found an increase in depression. I have one that found that maybe this isn't so bad if they have protective friendships. And so these are the kinds of statements that you're going to make in your paper, but you need to have figured out how all your sources address your theme before you can make these broad conclusions. Okay, so that's what I just summarized here. And again, this is an example. So your worksheet has a blank one. That's what you need to do for this week. So make sure you're reviewing your articles and reviewing your notes and identifying some big important themes.